Okay, y'all. So today we're reviewing for the Critical Thinking Lab quiz, which is linked on, I almost said Facebook. What I meant was Canvas. There we go. All right. When you create an experiment, you always start with a question, which is, does X have an effect on Y? First, the null hypothesis, abbreviated HO, says that there's no observed effect, which is no change, that X will not have an effect on Y. And the second hypothesis, which is the alternative hypothesis, says that an effect will be observed, that X does have an effect on Y and there is change. The null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis are opposite of one another. One predicts no change and the other predicts that there will be change. So here's an example. Here's our question. Will students score higher on the test if they study 5 hours instead of 1 hour? We're testing whether study time has an effect on test scores, that is, whether study time changes test scores. And the null hypothesis always predicts no change. So our null hypothesis is going to be that study time does not affect the test score. Alternative hypothesis predicts that there will be change. So the alternative hypothesis here is that study time does affect test score. All right, whenever you do an experiment, oh my God, is that a cat in here? Oh, I don't know how he got in here. Sorry, just. You. Leave. Moving on. All right, whenever you do an experiment, your data will support one of these two hypotheses. And when you talk about the results of your experiment, you're going to describe which hypothesis you accept and which one you reject. If you get the results that a hypothesis predicts, you're going to accept that hypothesis. And if you get the opposite results, you're going to reject it. So in this case, the null hypothesis states that study time will not affect test scores. So if we do the experiment and then we see that study time does affect test scores, then we reject the null hypothesis. We reject this one because our results contradict it. And then we would accept the opposite hypothesis, which is the alternative hypothesis. And conversely, the alternative hypothesis says that study time will affect test scores. So if we do the experiment and we see that the study time does not affect test scores, then we reject this hypothesis. And then we would accept the opposite hypothesis. All right, here's another example. The question for this experiment is, does the amount of food my dog eats affect his weight? The null hypothesis predicts no change. So the null hypothesis would be that the amount of food that he eats does not change his weight or does not affect his weight. The alternative hypothesis, remember, says that there will be a change. So the alternative hypothesis would be that the amount of food he eats does affect his weight, does change his weight. Notice in this case, we're not saying whether he will gain weight or lose weight, just that his weight will change. So let's say we do this experiment and we see that if the dog eats more food, his weight changes. We would accept the alternative hypothesis. We would accept the alternative hypothesis because it predicts change and we saw change. And then we would reject the null hypothesis, which is the opposite hypothesis. But if we find that when the dog eats more food, his weight doesn't change, then we'd accept the null hypothesis, which predicts no change. And since we're accepting the null hypothesis, we automatically reject the opposite hypothesis, which is the alternative hypothesis. All right, go ahead and try this. An experiment is designed to test if eating more bread makes you gain weight. What is the null hypothesis? Remember, the null hypothesis predicts no change. Pause the video. All right, I'm assuming that you've paused it. So the null hypothesis would say that eating more bread does not cause you to gain weight. It does not change your weight. The conditions to reject the null hypothesis is if we get the results opposite of what it predicts. So if eating more bread does cause a change in weight, does cause you to gain weight, then you'll reject the null hypothesis. And in that case, you automatically have to accept the opposite hypothesis, which is the alternative hypothesis. All right, go ahead and pause the video and come up with an alternative hypothesis for this, remembering that the alternative hypothesis predicts change. Okay, so the alternative hypothesis in this case would predict that if you eat more bread, you will gain weight. Your weight will change. And if you get the opposite results of the alternative hypothesis, then you reject the alternative hypothesis. So if eating more bread does not cause a change in weight, does not cause you to gain weight, then you'll reject the alternative hypothesis. And in that case, you would have to accept the opposite hypothesis, which is the null hypothesis. All right, designing a controlled experiment. Remember, we have three types of experiments: an observational experiment, where nobody changes anything. An example of that would be going to a nature preserve and watching an endangered species, maybe, to see what they do and how they interact with their environment. Like if you were observing the endangered Galapagos tortoise, maybe you would just go and watch what they eat, and perhaps you'd collect their poop and look to see what's in it. And you might watch how much water they typically drink or where they go during different times of the year. That's just observation. A simple comparison experiment is one with no control. Control is the standard state of something, or the ordinary, the normal state. Maybe you could say the typical state. So if you don't know the typical state of something, you would do a simple comparison experiment. For example, if you were testing how exercise affects the rate of heart disease, but you wanted to compare old people versus young people, well, neither old nor young is the typical state, so there's no control. And that is a simple comparison experiment. And lastly, a controlled or manipulated experiment is the kind that people usually think about when they think about a science experiment. An example of this would be if you have 3 strawberry fields and one field gets no fertilizer, and the second field gets a little fertilizer, and the third field gets a lot of fertilizer. The natural condition is no fertilizer, so that one would be the control. And you're going to compare the results of all the other fields to that one. There's 4 parts to a controlled experiment. Firstly, the independent variable, the dependent variable, the control or control group, and some constant factors, constants. First, let's talk about controls and constants. It's easy to get them mixed up because the words sound similar, but they mean very different things. Control is something that you compare your results to. And let's go back to the strawberry example, where the natural condition of the field is no fertilizer. So that's the control. And if you add fertilizer, then it's no longer in the natural state. So then when you add fertilizer to other fields and you grow strawberries, you're going to look back at that first field to see if the fertilizer is causing more strawberries to grow, or if there's no change at all, or maybe the fertilizer is even making the strawberries sick and they're not producing as much. But you always refer back to that original state, is your control. Constant is something that you're not testing, that you want to make sure it doesn't get in the way of your experiment and affect the results. So for the strawberries, you're trying to see if the amount of fertilizer makes your strawberries grow better. But if you plant one kind of strawberries in the first field and another kind in the second field and a different kind in the third field, then maybe the strawberries will all just grow differently because they're just different kinds of strawberries. They might be growing differently because of the fertilizer, but you don't know that. So you want to use the same kind of strawberries in your fields. So the constant is the kind of strawberries you're using. Think of another constant. What if you were to plant the same kinds of strawberries, but one of the fields happens to be in the shade and the others are in full sunlight? You're still giving the fields different amounts of fertilizer, but maybe the shady field will grow fewer strawberries. How do you know if that's because it's shady or because of the fertilizer? You don't know. So that's another thing you're going to have to keep constant. The last two parts of a controlled experiment are the variables. A variable just means something that's changing. There's two kinds of variables, the one that you are directly changing and the one that you're measuring. The one that you are directly changing is called the independent variable, and you can remember that by the I for independent. It is what I change. In the strawberry example, you're changing the amount of fertilizer you're giving the strawberries. And then you're going to measure how many strawberries you get to see if the fertilizer actually does anything useful. You hope that the strawberries are going to change, but you're not just reaching in there and changing them yourself. You've got to do something else to get them to change. And that something else is the independent variable. Oh, yeah, sometimes it's called the manipulated variable. So in this case, the independent variable is the amount of fertilizer because it's what I am directly changing. The thing that you directly control is the amount of fertilizer. Now you have to be really specific. The independent variable is, oh, hold on, just kidding. Moving on. All right, and then we have the dependent variable, and that's what is measured, and that's the response. So in the case of the strawberries, it would be the yield of strawberries is what you're looking for. That's how you're going to measure the success of your experiment. To help you find which variable is independent and which variable is dependent, you can insert them into one of these sentences. Does independent variable cause a change in dependent variable? What you would do is identify which things are changing in the experiment and then insert them into these blanks until the sentence makes sense. Another sentence you could use is, if I am testing the effect of the independent variable on something, I will monitor that effect by measuring the dependent variable. Example, trees receiving the most water produce the largest lemons. The independent variable here is the amount of water because that's what you are directly changing. You are either giving the trees more water or less water. And you can't just write water. Water is not the right answer. That's a wrong answer. If you just write that, how will somebody know what about the water you mean? Are you talking about how dirty the water is or where you got the water? No, you're testing the amount of water. So amount of water is the independent variable. And the dependent variable, what you're measuring to see the success of your experiment, is the size of the lemons. You can't just say lemons, that's wrong. If you write that, how will somebody know what about the lemons you're looking at? Do you mean their color? Do you mean how sour they are? No, you're measuring the size of the lemons. So the size of lemons is the dependent variable. It's also not amount of lemons. You're measuring the size of the lemons. All right, here's an example. More pounds of potatoes will be produced if the soil is fertilized more. All right, first let's identify the variables, the independent variable and the dependent variable. Variables, remember, are things that change. So we're going to find and underline the things that are changing in this experiment. The pounds of potatoes and if the soil is fertilized more, so the amount of fertilizer. Remember, there's two ways to find the variables. First, you could look to see which one you're measuring and which one you're directly changing. Or you could use the phrase from earlier, which is, does independent variable cause a change in dependent? So let's use the first method first. Find the independent variable. That's the one that I am directly changing. I for independent. Both of these things are changing, pounds of potatoes and amount of fertilizer. But there's only one that I am directly changing myself, which is the amount of fertilizer that I put in the soil. I hope there's going to be a change in the pounds of potatoes, but I can't just go to the potatoes and make them grow more. I have to do something to them. And the thing that I do, the thing that I change, is the independent variable. So by that method, we know that the independent variable is the amount of fertilizer in the soil. Caution you against a common mistake. When you're stating the independent variable, you can't just say soil and you can't just say fertilizer. You have to be specific. If you just say that the independent variable is soil or fertilizer, that's wrong. If you just say it's soil, then someone reading your answer won't know what that means. What about the soil are you changing? Are you changing the type of soil? Are you changing the amount of soil? No, you're changing the amount of fertilizer in the soil. So you have to say that. All right, now let's look at the dependent variable, which remember is the thing that you are measuring to find your results. What is the result that you're looking for? The thing that depends on what you're doing, which is why it's called the dependent variable. The result of your experiment is the pounds of potatoes that you're going to get. That's what you're measuring to see how your experiment turned out. So that is the dependent variable. The dependent variable depends on the other variable. That's why we call it the dependent variable. The number of pounds of potatoes depends on what you're doing. Now, you can't just say pounds and you can't just say potatoes because those are both wrong answers. You have to be specific. If you just say potatoes, well, what about the potatoes? Are you hoping that the amount of fertilizer will change the species of potato? Are you hoping it will change the color of potato? No, you're hoping that it will change the number of pounds of potatoes that you get. And similarly, if you just say that the dependent variable is pounds, well, that's also a wrong answer. Because what are you hoping will change? The pounds of fertilizer? The pounds of soil? No, the thing you're going to measure to look at is the pounds of potatoes, how many pounds of potatoes you are getting at the end of the experiment. Okay, now let's try the second method of identifying the dependent and independent variables. Remember this sentence, does independent variable cause a change in dependent variable? This is what we're using now, right here, this sentence. We try inserting each variable into the blanks, and when the statement makes sense, we know we found the dependent and independent variables. So let's try it out this way first. Does more pounds of potatoes cause a change in amount of fertilizer, or whether the soil is fertilized more? And that makes no sense. So we're going to try again. Does whether the soil is fertilized more cause a change in the pounds of potatoes? And that makes sense. So now we know that the independent variable is the amount of fertilizer, and the dependent variable is pounds of potatoes. All right, let's move on to the control. Oh, well, now you know what it is. Remember, a control is something that is used as a standard with which to compare the results of experiments. It's the standard state, the ordinary state, the natural conditions. And what's the natural conditions for a field with potatoes in it? It would be the soil without fertilizer. So soil without fertilizer is the control. Now let's think of some possible constants. Remember, constants are things that are kept constant. They're not changed during an experiment, but they could change the outcome if they were changed. They're things you're not testing. They're things you don't want to get in the way of your experiment and affect the results. So some possible things like that would be the amount of sunlight. If that changes throughout the experiment, that's going to affect our results. What if some of the potato plants are one species and some of them are a different species? Or maybe if part of the field gets more water than the other part. There's plenty of constants, but these are a few good ones. And again, you can't just say sunlight or species, or potato or water. Those are wrong answers. You have to be specific. So what's the null hypothesis? Remember, the null hypothesis predicts no change. So the null hypothesis here would be that the amount of fertilizer will not change the pounds of potatoes, or it will not have an effect on the pounds of potatoes. And you could also say that the amount of fertilizer, okay, yeah. And the alternative hypothesis, remember, predicts that there will be a change, or that what you're testing will have an effect. So in this case, it would be that the amount of fertilizer will change, or will have an effect on the pounds of potatoes. Now you pause the video and go ahead and try this one. All right. And here's the answers. The independent variable is what I am directly changing, which is how much carbon dioxide I'm giving the tree. A dependent variable is what I'm measuring to see the results of my experiment, which is the growth rate of the tree. The control is the normal state, so the tree with normal everyday atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. Constants could be the species of tree, the amount of sunlight the tree gets, the amount of water the tree gets. The null hypothesis says that the amount of carbon dioxide a pine tree receives will not change its growth rate. And the alternative hypothesis says that the amount of carbon dioxide a pine tree receives will change its growth rate. All right, now if you would like more practice, you can go ahead and do the variables and experimental design practice worksheet. I've provided the answers for that in case you want to check yourself. And then do the scientific methodology field study worksheet. Excuse me, I haven't provided those answers because there's an example you can use as a guide on the first page. And then take the critical thinking lab quiz, and you're going to have 30 minutes for that. I'll show you where these things are. All right, so here we are in modules. You scroll down to experimental design review. There's the variables and experimental design practice, the answers and the actual thing, and I should totally switch those. And the scientific methodology field study. And then here's the quiz, the critical thinking lab assessment. And that's all. Are we going to stop recording?